July 31st, 1944, for 17 a.m., banks of the WWII River, Normandy, France. Fog rolled low across the river like a living thing. Thick, gray, silent, swallowing everything it touched. The WWII's slow current moved beneath it in dark, glassy ribbons. The smell of wet earth, diesel fumes, and distant burning wheat drifted across the shoreline. Boots crunched softly through mud as Captain Raymond Holt of the U.S. 300th Engineer Combat Battalion knelt beside the riverbank, fingertips dipping into the cold water, breath rising in small clouds. Across the river, the faint outlines of shattered farmhouses stood like black teeth against the pre-dawn sky. Somewhere beyond them, German positions waited, watchful, listening, convinced the Americans would need at least 2 days to secure a crossing here. They were wrong. Holt rose slowly, wiping mud onto his jacket. The Bailey Bridge components lay in neat rows behind him. Steel panels, transoms, cord sections, deck plates. Each one glistened with dew, stacked like pieces of some colossal metal skeleton waiting to come alive. Trucks idle with engines rumbling low, their headlights covered in slit masks to hide the glow. Men whispered. Tools clinked. Hammers tapped against steel with the soft, careful rhythm of surgeons preparing instruments. Lieutenant Avery, Holt said quietly. Avery stepped beside him, wiping grease from his hands. He looked young in the half-light, but his eyes were sharp, focused. Everything's ready, sir. Holt nodded once. He looked across the WWII, imagining the German soldiers on the far bank, rifles resting on sandbags, certain the river would buy them another day, maybe 2. But not today. He motioned to the radio operator. Signal the column. Phase 1 begins now. The radio crackled with static, then a soft acknowledgement. Moments later, the low rumble of heavy machinery broke through the fog. Bulldozers emerged from the darkness, their silhouettes massive, metal scraping against stone as they cleared the shoreline. Combat engineers jogged beside them, carrying steel pins, wooden mallets, cable spools, acetylene torches, and portable generators. Their breath formed thick white plumes in the cold morning air. Holt stood over them, boots planted firmly in wet soil, hands behind his back. Gentlemen, he said, voice barely above a whisper, we build the bridge or the infantry behind us doesn't move. The men knew what that meant. Every hour lost gave the retreating German army time to regroup, reinforce, and fortify the next line of defense. Every hour mattered. The Bailey bridging panels clanged as squads lifted them onto roller tracks. Mud splashed up against their uniforms. Sweat mixed with condensation in the chill air. A corporal swung a sledgehammer, driving a steel pin into place with sharp metallic bang that echoed across the water. Another team locked transoms into the side panels with the swift, practiced rhythm of experts. The river crossing was coming alive. Sir, Avery said, pointing toward the opposite bank. Movement on the ridge. Holt raised his binoculars. Through the fog, he spotted a German observation post, 2 silhouettes, helmets shining faintly. They were leaning forward, studying the river, likely expecting to see nothing more than a dark expanse of water. Then the bulldozers revved louder. The Germans stiffened. One raised his binoculars. The fog thinned just enough for them to see the impossible. A bridge rising. Steel panels locking into place with machine-like precision, one after another, forming a growing lattice of metal stretching from the shoreline toward the river's heart. Holt didn't look up. Keep going, he called. They won't believe what they're seeing. And they didn't. Across the river, the German observation team scrambled. One shouted down the ridge. Another ran to a field telephone, stumbling over brush. They had expected days of preparation, days of breathing room. But the Americans were building a river crossing in minutes. A sergeant hammered the final pin into the first bridge segment. Sparks flew as a welder torched the support bracket into place. The deck plates clattered loudly as crews began laying them across the framework. The fog carried the sound across the water in eerie, metallic waves. Infantrymen, entire companies, waited in the tree lane behind the engineers, rifles ready, helmets low, watching in tense silence. They would advance the instant the bridge held. Holt checked his watch. 22 minutes since construction began. Almost halfway across. He looked up at the river, at the fog thinning around the emerging structure, at the dim dawn light outlining the metal skeleton his men were assembling with impossible speed. He allowed himself the smallest smile. "When the Germans see this," he murmured, "they'll rethink everything they believe about us." Far across the water, German officers stood frozen in disbelief. A crossing, an entire river crossing, was materializing in front of them as if willed into existence by some industrial sorcery. And it was only just beginning. July 31st, 1944, 4:41 a.m., via river crossing, Normandy. The fog shifted as if startled, swirling in restless circles around the rising structure. What had begun as scattered sections of cold steel now protruded into Vire like the spine of some metallic beast awakening at the engineer's command. Lantern light flickered against the panels, throwing long shadows across the water. Every clang of steel echoed across the river, carried by the damp air in jagged metallic ripples. Lieutenant Avery moved along the near bank, boots sinking into mud with every step. Rollers set, panel 3 advancing. He whispered, raising one hand to signal the next team. 8 men heaved, muscles straining under the weight as they rolled the next Bailey panel into position. Their breaths steamed in long white plumes, sweat mingling with river mist on their foreheads. Captain Holt watched from a few feet away, eyes patient and sharp. He had seen these men assemble dozens of Bailey spans. But tonight was different. Tonight the enemy was close enough to smell the smoke from their fires. Tonight time was a threat greater than any German rifle. A sudden gust parted the fog just long enough for Holt to see a glint across the river. Binocular lenses flashing. "They're watching us," Holt murmured. Avery glanced up. "Let them watch, sir. We'll be across before they know what hit them." The steady rumble of engines behind them deepened as additional trucks arrived with more prefabricated sections. Men formed a chain, passing tools and parts with rapid, disciplined motion. A corporal swung a wooden mallet, driving a locking bolt into place with hollow thuds. Sparks showered briefly from a portable cutting torch, shaping a stubborn panel edge. The bridge hummed with life as if responding to the synchronized heartbeat of the men building it. From the tree-lean, Sergeant Drew's infantry platoon crouched low, watching the bridge expand. Helmet rims dripped with dew as they listened to the rhythmic work of the engineers. "You ever seen one go up this fast?" Private Renner whispered. "Faster than fast," Drew replied. "This is madness." But he didn't sound worried. On the far bank, Oberleutnant Weber stood rigid at his observation post, fists tightening around his binoculars. He muttered in disbelief, Nein, das kann nicht sein. No, this cannot be." Below him, German soldiers scrambled along the trench line bordering the river. One ran to a field radio, shouting breathlessly. Another peered toward the Americans, shaking his head in shock. They had destroyed the original bridge thoroughly. Charges placed perfectly. Pillars collapsed into the river, access roads cratered. Yet the Americans were ignoring all of it, not repairing, not rebuilding, replacing, and at a speed no German engineering manual had ever described. Weber felt something cold crawl up his spine. The Americans didn't fear obstacles. They erased them with tools, manpower, and audacity. Back on the near bank, Holt strode forward as the engineers shouted, "Panel advancing, deck plates ready." Crews rushed to position themselves. The new span slid forward over the roller beams with a grinding metallic moan. One more push would set the midsection hovering over the deepest part of the Vire. Avery raised his gloved hand. "Brace it." Men jammed steel pins into place. Others tightened bolts with wrenches, shoulders heaving. Holt checked his watch again. 40 minutes since starting, more than halfway across. He exhaled slowly, knowing full well that German commanders would be confused, furious, and terrified all at once. They expected rivers to halt the American advance. They expected terrain to buy them days. But the Bailey Bridge in the hands of the U.S. combat engineers turned natural obstacles into brief inconveniences. Behind Holt, a column of Sherman tanks idled in the fog, gun barrels pointed at the sky like silent guardians. Their engines rumbled with pent-up anticipation, exhaust curling into the pre-dawn air. The tank crews leaned out of their hatches, watching the engineers with something like awe. They're really going to have us rolling by morning. A gunner murmured. If the Krauts don't shell this place first, another replied. They'd need to be awake enough to know what's happening. The gunner shot back. Across the river. Weber barked orders to his men, but confusion choked the trench line. One soldier fumbled with a flare. Another tried to confirm artillery coordinates. But the dense fog, the rapid construction, and the exhaustion of retreating units all collided into a moment of paralysis. The Americans were outpacing their ability to respond. Holt moved toward the water's edge again. Engineers had set the final roller track, and were beginning to push the third major section into place. The steel lattice extended far into the mist now, shimmering with dew. The river's surface slapped quietly against the low side panels. Lieutenant Avery, Holt said, voice even in the chaos, prepare for launch phase. Avery nodded, then turned to platoon. You heard him. Launch phase. Move like you mean it. A roar erupted behind them as the bulldozers revved, ready to push the next set of components down the rollers. The entire bridge structure shuddered, then began sliding outward inch by inch, steel grinding against steel, the river fog swirling around like smoke around a cannon. Weber watched, stunned. In less than an hour, the Americans had done what should have taken days. He lowered his binoculars slowly, realizing the truth sinking into every German officer along the front. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a machine, industrial, relentless, unstoppable. And the machine was crossing the river. July 31st, 1944. 5:12 a.m., Vire River, Normandy. The fog began to lift as dawn crept over the hills, turning the sky from inky black to a washed-out violet. Every minute, the light grew a little stronger, revealing more of the massive steel skeletons stretching across the river. Dew glimmered along the deck plates. Rivulets of condensation trickled down the side panels. The Bailey Bridge looked like a metal beast clawing its way from one bank to the other, each segment a rib forged from Allied determination. Captain Holt stood at the spear point of the operation, boots planted in wet mud, hands resting on his knees as he studied the nearly completed span. He could hear everything: the hammering of steel pins, the rumble of vehicles repositioning, the breathless commands passed between teams. It was the sound of American industry compressed into a single riverbank. Avery jogged up to him, panting slightly. Sir, rollers are locked for the next push. Launch crew is set. Good, Holt said. We finish it before sunrise. Avery nodded, wiping mud from his brow. He didn't say what both men knew. Sunrise meant visibility. Visibility meant artillery. If the Germans had any batteries properly ranged, the whole operation could be reduced to twisted steel and bodies in seconds. Holt shouted to the teams, Next section, move. Dozens of engineers surged forward. The new bridge segment, massive, cold, unyielding, rose on the shoulders of men straining under its weight. Metal groaned. Mud slurped under boots. A corporal shouted for clearance. A welder lit his torch, sparks spraying like fireflies into the fog. The engineers moved with purpose, with rhythm, with something like defiance. They were not infantry charging into fire. They were not pilots battling in the air. Their war was waged with hammers, with rollers, with bolts, with sweat. And tonight, they were winning. Across the river, Oberleutnant Weber watched in breathless disbelief as the Americans connected the next major section. His binoculars trembled in his hands. The fog thinned just enough for him to see the full shape of the bridge, stretching far longer than he had expected, reaching across most of the Vire. He whispered, Mein Gott, my God. A German private beside him muttered, Are they mad? They cannot build a bridge this fast. They are not mad, Weber said in a hollow voice. They are prepared. Below them, German soldiers argued around the field telephone, trying to confirm artillery coordinates. But the batteries were repositioning farther east. The river obstruction was supposed to buy them time they no longer had. A German sergeant cursed loudly, slamming his helmet with both hands. It should be impossible. No army builds a structure like that overnight. But the Americans weren't just building a structure. They were rewriting the rules. Back on the near bank, Holt crouched next to the final set of rollers. Push on my call. Avery and the crew placed their hands on the cold steel of the bridge. Their breath fogged the air in thick bursts. Holt counted silently in his head. 1, 2, 3. He raised his hand. Push. The men heaved. Muscles strained. Boots dug into mud. The entire span lurched forward with a grinding metallic roar. River water churned violently beneath the steel arc as the final section slid over the rollers and locked into position. For a brief instant, everything fell silent. Then, clang, the final locking pin slammed home. A shout erupted from the engineers, but Holt silenced them with a single raised hand. Joy was earned later. Now came the reinforcement phase. Decking crew move, secure every panel. Holt barked. Men sprinted onto the bridge, dropping to their knees as they hammered down planks. Wrenches clicked. Nails drove into wet wood. The deck thudded under the weight of boots. Chains rattled as tension rods were tightened to prevent sway. Drew's infantry platoon watched from a tree lean, eyes wide. "That's it," Private Renner muttered. "They've actually done it." Sergeant Drew nodded. "Get ready. We move the moment they clear the way." Sunlight cracked through the last layer of fog, striking the bridge like a spotlight. Dew on the steel glittered in the early light. Holt stepped onto the structure, testing the deck with careful weight. It didn't sway. It didn't creak. It held. "Lieutenant Avery," he said. "Send the signal." Avery lifted a red flare pistol. Fired. The flare arced overhead, bursting into bright crimson light. Across the tree lean, the first Sherman tank roared to life. Its treads clattered as it lurched forward, engine bellowing. The crew inside checked their weapons, loaded ammunition, braced themselves. Drew's infantry fell in behind it, lined up and ready. Holt watched the tank approach, its turret rotating slightly, its hull looming larger with each rumbling second. The bridge vibrated under the engine's roar. This was the moment. This would prove whether the bridge and all the men who built it had succeeded. The Sherman reached the foot of the Bailey span. Its treads touched the steel. The bridge held firm. 1 foot, 5 feet, 10 feet, rolling deeper onto the span, the tank's weight pushing down, testing every bolt, every pin, every sliver of effort poured into the night. Avery held his breath. The tank kept moving, smoothly, confidently, crossing the point where the original French bridge had crumbled. Across the river, Weber stepped back in horror. "They're crossing," he whispered. They were, and nothing could stop them now. July 31st, 1944, 5:39 a.m., via River, Normandy. The first Sherman tank rolled across the Bailey Bridge with the full weight of American steel and momentum behind it. The deck plates thudded rhythmically beneath its treads, metal groaning but steady, a deep vibration passing to the structure like a heartbeat. Captain Holt walked alongside it, one hand brushing the railing, feeling every tremor through his fingertips. He had built crossings before, but never one with the fate of a division hanging on the next 60 seconds. The tank advanced halfway, turret rotating slightly as the gunner scanned the fog-covered ridgeline. Dew glistened on the chassis, running in thin lines down the armor. The crew braced for possibility that the bridge might bow, or worse, fail. Sherman tanks weren't just heavy. They were unforgiving to weak structures. But the bridge held. Perfectly. Avery exhaled a shaky breath. Around him, the engineers exchanged silent glances, equal parts exhaustion and awe. They knew what they had built, but seeing a 30-ton machine crawl across their work less than an hour after they started, that was something else entirely. Sergeant Drew's infantry followed close behind, boots clattering over the steel decking, rifles ready, faces set. The fog thin enough to reveal the open opposite shore, German trenches, collapsed barricades, abandoned equipment. Everything looked frozen, suspended in time. But the Germans were not frozen. On the far slope, Oberleutnant Weber scrambled down toward his trench line, shouting orders that broke apart in the rising wind. "Prepare firing positions. Machine guns ready. They are crossing. We must stop them." But his men were exhausted. Half of them had marched through the night. Many had gone days without proper sleep, and the idea that the Americans had built a full bridge in under an hour struck them like a blow. "We cannot stop tanks," one private stammered. "We were told the river would hold them," another whispered. Weber slammed his fist against the sandbag wall. "The river cannot help us now. Prepare the line." Back on the bridge, the first Sherman reached the far bank and paused, engine idling heavily. The commander cracked open the hatch, scanning the terrain. Holt waved forward. "Go. Secure the trilene." The tank lunged forward, treads biting into soft earth, smashing through German barbed wire that had been positioned under the assumption the river would remain uncrossable. Behind it, a second Sherman rolled onto the bridge, then a third. The structure vibrated under the weight. Steel pins clacked. Bolts trembled. Holt walked carefully, listening. The bridge wasn't just holding. It was thriving under strain. Avery jogged up alongside him. "Sir, armor column is forming up. They'll have 3 more cross before sunrise." "Good," Holt said. "Infantry first. Armor second. Supply trucks as soon as we reinforce the left truss." Avery nodded and sprinted back toward a team already tightening sway braces. Across the river, Weber raised his binoculars. The sight made his stomach twist. The Americans weren't trickling across. They were pouring across. A steady stream of infantry advanced with the Shermans, boots splashing through shallow puddles, rifles raised, helmets gleaming with dew. A Browning machine gun team ran forward, setting up behind a collapsed stone wall. Mortar crews knelt beside their tubes, adjusting angles. This wasn't a crossing. This was an invasion moving at factory speed. Weber barked. "Open fire!" A scattered burst of German rifle fire cracked through the air. Muzzle flashes lit the trench line in flickering orange bursts. Bullets pinged off Sherman armor with futile sparks. Infantry hit the dirt, returning fire with controlled bursts. Then the Shermans roared to life. Their guns fired with deep concussive thunder. The ground shook as high-explosive shells slammed into German positions. Weber's trench line erupted in clouds of dirt and shattered sandbags. Men dove for cover, shouting over the roar. The smell of gunpowder and burning grass filled the air. The bridge, untouched, continued feeding American forces onto the far shore. Holt stood near the midsection, watching as the 4th Sherman clattered past him. The sun had fully breached the horizon now, lighting the battlefield in stark gold. The bridge gleamed in the early light, like a victory forged from sweat and steel. But Holt wasn't smiling. "Avery," he called. "Status on the left truss?" "Braced and locked." Avery replied, "We can take the trucks." "Signal them through." Behind them, a convoy of supply trucks rumbled forward. Ammunition crates, fuel drums, medical kits, food, spare parts, all of it desperately needed at the front. Weber watched on the ridge, despair settling deep in his bones. The WWII was supposed to be the barrier, the stopper, the natural shield behind which the German army could breathe, regroup, and plan. Instead, the Americans had crossed it before dawn. Weber lowered his binoculars. "It's over," he whispered. Not the battle, not the war, but the belief that terrain could save them. Back on the bridge, Holt crossed his arms, eyes fixed on the far bank, where Sherman after Sherman disappeared into the fog toward the next line of defense. "We built the impossible tonight," he murmured, and the impossible was rolling forward. July 31st, 1944, 6:04 a.m., via river crossing Normandy. By the time the sun broke fully over the horizon, the fog had withdrawn into ragged patches clinging to the treetops. Golden light spilled across the valley, revealing a scene no German commander had believed possible. A complete Bailey Bridge spanning the Weir, alive with movement, metal shimmering as if forged fresh from a furnace. On the near bank, the earth trembled under the steady rhythm of armored treads. Supply trucks rolled forward, engines growling, canvas flapping lightly in the breeze. Men shouted logistical orders. "Ammo crates left. Fuel to the east. Medics, follow the second platoon." Their voices echoing through the morning air. Captain Holt wiped his brow with a greasy sleeve, then lifted his eyes toward the far bank. The Shermans were fanning out through the fields, forming a spearhead that punctured the first-in layer of German resistance. In the distance, muffled explosions rumbled to the ground like distant thunder. Behind him, Avery jogged up still breathing hard. Sir, second column's ready. Bridging crews are pulling the reinforcement tools. We're stable. Holt nodded, planting his boots firmly on the steel decking. Stable enough to bring half a division across? Avery smirked despite the exhaustion. Sir, after what we pulled off tonight, we could march a circus over this thing. Holt allowed himself the faintest grin. Then he shouted, Clear the bridge. Next wave coming through. Infantry surged forward, boots hammering the decking in a steady rhythm. They passed Holt with nods and murmured acknowledgments. Some tapping the railing as if it were a charm for good luck. Others simply glancing at the engineers with stunned respect. One private slowed as he passed Holt. Hell of a miracle you built here, Captain. Holt shook his head. Not a miracle, just math muscle and not enough sleep. The private chuckled and continued on. Across the river, Oberleutnant Weber limped through the ruins of his trench line, smoke curling up from shattered sandbags. His ears rang from tank shell blasts. His uniform was streaked with dirt from diving into cover. Every direction he turned revealed another piece of evidence that the river, his river, had become meaningless. Behind him, a junior soldier pointed toward the bridge with trembling hands. Herr Oberleutnant, look. Weber turned and saw the impossible in clear daylight. The Americans weren't just crossing. They were flowing, like a steel river their own. Tanks, trucks, infantry, command cars, jeeps, all of them moving with relentless rhythm. The Bailey Bridge bearing every load without a hint of strain. More engineers jogged onto the far shore, some with demolition packs, others with shovels and pickaxes, already preparing to dismantle German obstacles beyond the tree-line. A machine, industrial, tireless, unyielding, had replaced a natural barrier. Weber sank onto a fallen beam, head dropping into his hands. We cannot hold them, he whispered. Back on the bridge, Holt walked the length of the span, tapping each joint, checking bolts, ensuring no panel had shifted under the weight of the armor. The bridge hummed beneath his boots, vibrating with the life of all the machines crossing it. Halfway across, he paused. The Weir River flowed beneath him in slow currents, sunlight glinting off its surface. Last night it had been a threat, a problem, an obstacle. Now it was simply geography, background scenery beneath an unstoppable advance. Avery approached from behind. Sir, Colonel Matthews wants a status report. Holt turned, eyes steady. Tell him the crossing is secure. And tell him he better get his trucks moving, because we're not slowing down for anyone. Avery saluted and jogged off. Another Sherman approached the far end of the bridge, turret tracking left to cover the infantry. The tank commander gave Holt a quick thumbs up from a hatch before disappearing down the road. The engineers standing nearby watched the procession with tired pride. Some slumped against their tool crates. Others crouched at the water's edge to wash mud from their faces. A few simply stood there, hands on hips, staring at the bridge as if unsure whether they'd truly built it. Sergeant Drew appeared next to Holt, rifle slung over his shoulder. Intel says German units east of here are already retreating, he said. Word is they thought the river would slow us until tonight. Holt kept his gaze on the horizon. Then let's make sure they don't get another chance to breathe. Across the tree-line, American mortars thumped rhythmically, soft puffs of smoke rising above the fields. The ground shuddered as shells landed deeper into German territory. Crackles of gunfire followed as infantry pushed forward, supported by the armor that owed its movement to the bridge behind them. Holt stepped forward again, placing one hand on the cool steel railing. This is what wins wars, he murmured. Not the tanks, not the rifles, but the ability to move, to advance, to refuse to let geography dictate the pace of battle. A breeze swept across the bridge, carrying the smell of oil, fresh-cut wood, burning brush, and the faint metallic tang of spent ammunition. The river whispered beneath him, but its voice held no power now. Behind him, a convoy of trucks approached, engines roaring with urgency. Ahead of him, the sound of battle grew louder, and around him, the bridge, his bridge, stood firm. A road forged from steel, a path carved through nature, a message written plainly for anyone watching. You cannot stop us. July 31st, 1944, 6:31 a.m., Eastern Approach Road, beyond the Vire River. The rising sun painted the valley in fierce strokes of orange and gold, casting long shadows behind the American armor columns pouring through the countryside. The smell of churned soil, diesel fumes, and shattered pine drifted across the fields as the Shermans cut through French farmlands like a moving wall of steel. The Bailey Bridge, still humming with the vibrations of trucks and tanks, had transformed the Vire from a natural defense line into nothing more than a memory. Captain Holt stood at the far end of the bridge, watching the last truck in the first convoy disappear behind a hedgerow. Infantrymen marched behind it, boots thudding in coordinated rhythm. Artillery tractors followed, dragging 155mm howitzers over the steel deck with rattling chains and clanking wheels. The entire movement was so fluid, so relentless, that the bridge seemed less like a structure and more like a living artery feeding the advance. Avery ran up from a near bank, his uniform stained with mud and sweat. "Sir, recon units say the Germans are breaking. Local civilians report they're pulling out of St. Aubin entirely." Holt nodded slowly. They thought they had time. Rivers give time. Bridges take it away. Avery grinned. "And we didn't just take it, we stole it." Holt pressed a hand to the steel framework beside him. "That's the point. This bridge wasn't for River. It was for the clock." Behind him, the engineers gathered their equipment, coiling cables, wiping down tools, stacking spent bolts into crates. A few men sat on overturned ammo boxes, breathing deeply, exhaustion catching up to them now that the adrenaline had thinned. The fog had fully cleared, leaving the valley to reveal the enormity of what they had built. Their handiwork stretching across the Vire like a monument to American persistence. A distant explosion rolled across the fields. Holt instinctively looked up. On the far ridge, German forces scrambled in disarray. A mortar crew tried to set up a firing position, only to be forced back by a Sherman's coaxial machine gun. Gray-clad infantry retreated through the trees, their shapes flickering between branches like ghosts. The German lines were unraveling, slow at first, then rapidly, like a snagged thread being pulled apart. Oberleutnant Weber limped behind his retreating soldiers, shouting for order. "Pull back!" To the second line. "Schnell!" But his voice carried no authority now. His men were not just tired, they were demoralized. The river was supposed to stop the Americans. The engineers were supposed to be slow. Bridges were supposed to take days. But the Americans had shattered all of those assumptions in a single night. A young German private stumbled alongside him. "Sir, how did they build it so quickly?" Weber didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the bridge, the clean lines of its trusses, the precise angles of its sections, the shimmering strength of its metal under morning light. It made no sense. It defied every expectation he had of American engineering. In truth, it frightened him. Meanwhile, on the American side, Sergeant Drew's infantry platoon advanced into the open fields, helmets low, weapons raised. Renner trotted beside him, glancing back at the bridge. "Sergeant," he said, "I still can't wrap my head around it. We crossed that river in less time than it takes to pitch a tent." Drew smirked. "Engineers don't sleep. They just build." A tank commander leaned out of his Sherman turret and shouted toward Holt, "Captain, we've pushed them back past the orchard. Road ahead is clear." Holt raised a hand in acknowledgement. "Keep moving. Don't let them reorganize." The Sherman revved forward, tread spitting dirt. Infantry followed, spreading out across the hedgerow patterns that defined the Normandy countryside. Birds burst from trees as artillery shells whistled overhead. The battlefield churned in 1,000 directions at once. But at the river, everything remained strangely calm. Avery approached Holt again. "Sir, what now? Reinforce the bridge? Prep for demolition?" Holt shook his head. "No, this bridge stays for the next wave, and the wave after that, and the one after that." Avery nodded slowly. "We turn a river into a highway." "Exactly," Holt said. He walked to the center of the bridge, boots echoing against steel decking. Below him, the Vire moved in indifferent silence, as if the river itself understood it no longer held any power here. The Bailey Bridge, half steel, half defiance, stretched across it without apology. Holt paused, watching the steady march of supply trucks and half-tracks, the endless flow of men and material moving east. Every engine, every tread mark, every rattling wheel wrote the same message across the land. We are coming. We are not stopping. And nothing you believe will save you. Across the valley, a single German artillery shell arced ineffectively overhead, landing far in the river in a plume of dirt and smoke. It was a gesture, nothing more. A final flicker of resistance swallowed quickly by the American advance. Holt looked out toward the horizon, where the smoke of battle thickened. This is how wars are won, he murmured. Not just by fighting, not just by shooting, but by moving. Faster than the enemy can understand, faster than they can recover, faster than they can believe. The Bailey Bridge behind him hummed under the weight of yet another convoy. Speed had become the weapon. Engineering had become the spear. And today, the river, like the German lines beyond it, had broken.